Listen to him. But tonight I'm going to turn it over to Ed Engel. And last week, if you were here, Ed talked about the World Trade Centers, what happened, on September 11th, and focused on Building 7. And to me, it was quite an eye-opener. And Ed's here to talk about Part 2. And I'll let him discuss what that is. And so, everybody, please give Ed a big hand. Thank you. Thank you.
How are we doing for sound? Okay, we're good. All right. Everybody hear me? Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for coming out tonight to learn more about what happened at the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. I have a few questions. How many of you were here last week? Okay, so we got a few new people. How many engineers in the audience? Do I have any engineers? Okay, I got one there. Okay, they're electrical. That's right. You were here last week. Well, you guys were the smart guys. I could never take that electrical stuff. I wonder how many people here have, just a show of hands real quick, how many people have doubts about the official story about what happened at the World Trade Center? Okay, well, I do like to get people that have doubts because it's good to have a conversation with people that don't believe what you're saying a lot of the times because, this is the real test of your thoughts. But I know there's a lot of technical details about this subject, and this is a presentation that I'm an engineer. I work with architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. It's a nonprofit. We took this subject up starting back in 2006 because the story that we saw published by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is a branch of the Department of Commerce, they came out with an engineering report. It's 13,402 pages long on the Twin Towers. And of course, most people don't have time, even if you're an engineer, to pour through that and come to any kind of understanding of there may be problems with it, because you can hide a lot of things in 13,402 pages. And so our research showed that there was some serious problems with that report, very serious problems, and I'll try to present those to you tonight. So this is going to be a critical look at the National Institute of Standards and Technology and the report that they presented. And I don't mean to cast aspersions on the many fine people that work for that organization. There's a lot of people there that are doing a wonderful job, and it's the old Bureau of Standards, which was converted to the National Institute of Standards and Technology in 1988 and given a bunch of new responsibilities. And they have some great people there doing great work. But somehow in that process, and I think we can all surmise that it was due to the political aspects of this building catastrophe, that somebody was able to get in there and make critical decisions at certain points during the investigation that led the investigation off in a direction which was not consistent with the evidence. And that's what concerns us as engineers. Of course, we have every sympathy and empathy for all the people that suffered losses, the people that died, the people that were injured, the first responders, and all the people that suffered as a result of the decisions that came about as a result of the examination of the evidence, which was faulty. So that's where I'm going with this. And this is a presentation that was put together we've got about 3,600 engineers across the country and in Europe and in Asia that have helped us with this research and that have put this information together. I'm just the messenger here. This is all people that have put this together painstakingly by going through the government reports and looking at each and every word and every page and discerning there's a lot of good engineering there, but there's some critical decisions that were made that led this off in the wrong direction. So that's what we're focused on, because we have a responsibility to the public to provide safe structures and safe devices for all of us to use safely. And you were betrayed that day. We were especially betrayed in the civil engineering profession because our leadership has taken a position that the government reports are just fine. And we take exception to that. So we've been taking this information out to the rank and file engineers around the country. We've presented this to more than 1,000 engineers at this point because we want to see if they agree with us or if they agree with the leadership of the organizations. And it's 1,000 to nothing. They agree with us. They don't agree with the position of our leadership. So this is a very disturbing situation for us, and something that we are trying to get traction for to get a new investigation. And we'll talk about what we want later on. So let me just start on this. These are the towers. Everybody knows where they were if you're over 30 years old on the day that those towers came down, September 11th, 2001. And it was a monumental event that changed world history. Here's the North Tower, tower number 1. It's got the antenna on top of it. So as we go through this, you'll be able to identify it. This is the tower behind it, standing somewhat behind it. That's Tower 2, the South Tower. And this is Building 7 in front of it. This is taken from the north. This is the building that we discussed last week. So we're going to look at several things. And these numbers here are going to, you'll see these numbers up in the top left corner of the slides. That's what we're talking about. We'll talk about the background of the two buildings, the aircrafts that hit them, the NIST theory of why they failed, the evidence of the core columns that failed first, the American Society of Civil Engineers, which is our professional organization that published the progressive collapse theory that backs up the NIST theory. We'll analyze that theory, and then we'll talk about the South Tower, other high-rise fires, the destruction of the evidence, and then we'll summarize the problems with the report, and we'll put them into various categories. Today we're going to talk mostly about the North Tower because the evidence on the North Tower is a little bit stronger and clearer because of the antenna on the top of the building. It actually turns out to help us with our analysis of how the building came down. And so, but everything that we're saying applies equally to both towers. Both towers were constructed in the same way. Both towers came down in the same manner. So the first aspect is to what were the buildings like? This is a typical building, high-rise building of the old style, which is built with columns, steel columns, and a grid of steel girders and beams that run throughout the building. The towers were built with a new concept, relatively new concept, and that is around the exterior you had a dense group of columns that are box columns, and as you can see, there's a lot of columns around the perimeter, and then they had a core column in the middle, and then they used very lightweight floor trusses to connect between the perimeter columns and the interior columns, and that gave them a lot of unobstructed floor space in the building and made it a very desirable structure from the standpoint of the builder, because you're going to get a lot of rental space there that you wouldn't get in a normal building that had columns, that break up the space. And this is a very strong building, probably the strongest high-rise building in the world at the time that it was built. These exterior columns and interior columns are massively stronger than they needed to be. They have a factor of safety. The perimeter columns are 5 times stronger than they needed to be, and the interior columns are 3 times stronger than they needed to be to carry the applied loads. And the applied loads, of course, were the weight of the building itself, and the contents of the building, the live load, the people and the furniture and everything that you load into the building. And then it's got to withstand loads that are applied to it from the side, which would include earthquake loads and wind loads primarily. Usually the wind load is the worst load on the building, especially with a building. This building was 1,300 and something feet tall, so you get some ferocious winds, and it had to withstand those. And so that's sort of the idea behind the design. It was a relatively new and revolutionary design at the time that it was constructed in the early 70s. Here we see the floor plan, and the columns around the outside, the distances, this is 207 feet square, and the largest floor span is 60 feet, that's here, and the core of the columns is 135 feet by 87 feet. And so you get about 43,000 square feet of usable floor space per floor. So in the interior, you have the stairwells and the elevators. And these columns on the outside are only about 38 inches apart. So you don't have any big bay windows looking out over the view, and that was one of the criticisms of the architecture. Some people said, well, this isn't very friendly to the people that are working in it, because they don't get to look out over the city, because these windows in between these columns are high and narrow. So that's one of the things that you lose with this design. They were solidly constructed. In the interior, you have 47 massive steel core columns, and on the exterior, you had 240 steel perimeter columns. And here you get a picture of it as it was coming up. These are the core columns here, big I-beams in the shape of a capital I with a big flange on the top and the bottom and an I section in the middle. And these are, you can see the perimeter columns here. These are boxes. They're 14 inches square, and they get thicker as you go down because they have to carry more weight at the bottom of the building. So you can, the building looks like it, and it is uniform all the way up, but you have to imagine that structurally it's like a pyramid, because you have to carry all the weight above it at any particular section. So down here at the bottom, you're carrying the weight of the entire structure above it. So the thickness of the box beams on the perimeter gets thicker as you go down, and the size of the I-beams in the interior core columns get bigger as you go down. And we'll take a look at some of those core columns here. This is what it looks like at the bottom. This is what the core beams look like at the column, at the bottom. And as you go up, they get thinner and thinner until you get to the top. They look like this. So you can see that the dead weight of the building is more on the bottom of the building than it is on the top of the building. The top of the building is relatively light compared to the bottom of the building, even though it looks the same all the way up. Structurally, it's a pyramid. Okay? They used 12 different kinds of steel at different heights on the perimeter columns to accommodate the wind load and the seismic stresses, and keeping the gravity-induced unit stress on both perimeter and core columns the same. Otherwise, the floors would warp under loads. So this is a tricky proposition. And here's some of the 4 different kinds of steel that they use. The regular grade steel is good for about 36,000 pounds per square inch. And then they had an intermediate grade that was up to, what does that say there? 50,000, then 65,000, then really high strength steel at 100,000 psi. So you could vary not only the size of the member in terms of its thickness, but you could also vary the strength of the steel. So those are the 2 things that the designers played with to make it withstand the loads that it was going to be subjected to. So what happened on September the 11th? First of all, the North Tower was hit by an airplane at 8:46 a.m. It collapsed 102 minutes later. That was American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767, and it was traveling at an estimated 473 miles per hour. Now those are the numbers that the National Institute of Standards and Technology used for their analysis. We're not verifying them, and we're not saying that they're true or accurate, but we're going to try to replicate what they did using the same information, because that's the way engineering and science works. You have to see if you can replicate what somebody else did. So we're taking the NIST information. This is the NIST information. The South Tower was hit at 9:03, and it collapsed in 56 minutes. That was United Flight 175. It was the same type of aircraft, a Boeing 767. It was traveling at 566 miles per hour. If you look at the way the North Tower was hit, you see the plane coming in. This is the north face, and the airliner hit it about between the 99th and the 93rd floor. And if you look at the relationship of the plane to the core columns, you see that it was hitting on the long side of the core, whereas on the south, the plane came in from the south, and it hit at an angle and was hitting on the short side of the core columns. Now, that's important structurally for how the building behaves when it's applied. These loads from the aircraft are applied to the structure. Looking at the North Tower, we see that the plane's nose hit the 95th floor on the north side, and the plane was pitched about 10.6 degrees downward, and but the 98th floor is where the collapse began. So that's a curious fact, and one of the things that erased our curiosity. Looking at the face of the North Tower, this is what you see. You see the outline of the plane here. It was had the wings rolled up at about 25 degrees. You see the different colors, by the way, are the different grades of steel that were used. So, each color represents a different grade of steel. So you can see how they patchwork this together depending upon what stress it was going to be subjected to under the wind loads. So here's the outline of the plane. You see at the 98th floor, the starboard or the right wing just barely impacted the 98th floor. The port wing just barely impacted the down here at the 94th floor. The main impact was between those two floors. Here's a discussion by a well-known structural engineer, Charlie Thornton, and he talks about what the significance of that impact was.
The fact that they were designed to resist over 13,000 tons of wind pressure meant that they could not be knocked over. In a remarkably prescient interview given over 15 years ago, Charlie Thornton, now one of the investigators, considered the scenario.
Well, 13,000 tons is a lot of force. People always talk about an airplane crashing into a building. And in 1944 or 45, a plane did crash into the Empire State Building. But the largest aircraft flying today, at least commercially, the 747, fully loaded, is on the order of 300 tons. So if you think about a 300-ton element crashing into a building that's been designed to carry 13,000 tons, you can see that an aircraft crashing into the World Trade Center would probably not do anything to the major building. It could affect localized structural elements, could knock out a column, and there could be some damage. But as far as a plane knocking a building over of that type, that would not happen.
Since the Empire State accident had shown that a plane could crash into a New York skyscraper, the designers were forced to consider.
Okay, so the towers were designed to take a hit from the largest aircraft in the sky commercially at that time, which was a Boeing 707. And the Boeing 707 is very comparable to the 767s that hit the buildings. And so the impact was planned. They designed the building to withstand that impact. John Skilling, who's now deceased, was the designer, and he said that he designed the tower to take a hit from a Boeing 707. And he was asked in 1993, the same year that there was a bomb planted in the North Tower, if you'll remember, there was an attempt to bring it down at that time, with a truck bomb in the parking lot. And he was asked, what about a plane crash? And he said, well, the biggest problem would be that the jet fuel would dump into the building, but the building would still be there. In fact, at one point he said, you could take out all the columns on the perimeter on one side and half the columns on the adjacent side, and the building would still stand. So that's how strong this building was. It was tremendously strong. One of the things that happened when the plane hit, and here we see the North Tower, we can see the antenna here. This is the North Tower, so this is the north face. This is the plane hitting after it had hit. And this is a photograph that we're going to just illustrate how the loads from above were carried down around the impact zone, and the building was still able to stand. That's a graphical description of what was going on with the loads. The loads were being carried around the impact zone and down into the lower part of the building. So the building had no problem standing up under that impact. Now, in the future, I'm going to be talking about 3 zones of the building. First of all, there's the impact zone. That's where the plane hit, the few 4 or 5 floors that were impacted by the impact of the plane. There's the upper part of the building above the impact zone, and there's the lower part of the building below the impact zone. So those are the 3 zones, because we need to think about those zones, because that's how NIST explains and we understand how the building came down. It was the fact that the upper part of the building, the plane impact weakened the columns. This is the NIST explanation. The plane impact took out some of the columns, and so it weakened the impact zone. Then the fires, which spread throughout that zone, further softened the steel and caused the steel to lose some of its strength, and that caused it to be unable to withstand the weight of the building above, and the building above fell down onto the lower part of the building and crushed it all the way down to the ground. Now, from a common sense standpoint, if you remember that the top of the building is much lighter than the bottom of the building as you go down, does it make sense to us that perhaps 10 or 15% of the weight of the building could fall on 80 to 85% of the building and cause it to collapse all the way to the ground, when the building was constructed to withstand between 3 and 5 times the weight of the building? We don't think that makes sense just from a common sense standpoint, but then when you begin to examine it, then you begin to look at the numbers and see what really happened. Here's the NIST analysis of what happened when the planes, this is the North Tower again, the plane hits on the north side, it comes through after 2/20 of a second, it has basically shattered. Remember, these columns are only 38 inches apart. The plane is made out of aluminum alloy, so the aluminum wings and most of the fuselage were shattered upon impact, and by the time the debris got to the core columns, there was not any large structure to impact those core columns. This is their analysis. We think it's probably pretty good. This is again the NIST report showing the damage on the 94th, the 95th, the 96th, and the 97th floors, and you see that the damage was most massive on the 95th and the 96th, pretty good on the 94th floor, less on the 97th floor. They don't even show the 98th floor, which is where the collapse initiated. So that's a bit curious. This is sort of a pictorial view of the core columns on the North Tower, and they said that this is the kind of damage that was caused by the plane impact to the core columns. And we see that there's a couple of columns that were broken, and some of them floors were displaced and broken down, and so there was some damage to the core columns. But remember, there's 47 columns here, and probably they're showing 5 or 6 of them were severely damaged by the impact. The jet fuel effects were taken into account by NIST, and here they show that on the 98th floor, for instance, where the collapse initiated, there were about 240 gallons of fuel that were dispersed there. Most of the fuel was dispersed on the 94th and the 95th and the 96th floors because that's where the plane impacted. Then they say, well, they studied that, and they said, well, the amount of fuel spilled only influenced the results of the first few minutes because the long-term behavior of the simulated fires was unaffected. So the fuel on the plane was effective at starting the fires, but most of it burned off within a few seconds. Most of the fuel was carried in the wings. The wings were shattered when they went through the columns. That aerosolized, mixed the fuel with air, and it ignited. And if you remember the videos, there were big explosions of yellow and orange flame outside the building. That's where most of the fuel burned off. The aircraft fuel had burned off within a few minutes. The only fires that remained were the fires that had been set, which was the office furnishings that were in the building that were flammable. So the aircraft fuel was only instrumental in starting the fires. The fires that burned for after that first few minutes were all just combustibles from the offices. So here's the reasons why the aircraft impact and the jet fuel would not have caused the collapse. The wings would have not made it to the central core. Most of the jet fuel was aerosolized on impact. Most of it outside the building. The fuel which did enter the building burned up within a few minutes. The redundant steel frame redistributes loads. Well, redundant just means there's a factor of safety there. It's stronger than it needs to be. And the factor of safety against vertical collapse was 5-to-1 for the central core, for the perimeter columns, and 3-to-1 for the central core. That's far too high for the impact damage to approximately 20% of the columns to have caused collapse. If you built this thing much stronger than it needs to be, you can still lose a lot of your structure, and it's going to be able to withstand it. So NIST had this theory, and the theory that they have is that the perimeter columns failed first, and that's what brought the building down. That's what initiated the collapse. So they said what happened was the fires heated up the floor trusses, and we'll look at the floor trusses in a minute here. These are light floor trusses with a pan on top and concrete poured on top of the pan. And they said that the fires weakened these trusses, and they deflected. And when they deflected, they pulled in the perimeter columns, and the perimeter columns failed successively around the building, and that's what brought the building down. So that's their theory of why the building failed. In order to try to prove that theory, they made some truss models. They made some half-size truss models, and they subjected them to heat. And here's their computer animation of their model. This is the floor truss. and this shows the heat that was subjected to, and you can see the heat at the connections, that the core columns and at the perimeter columns are very hot, and they said that this buckled, and that's what pulled in the perimeter columns. But if you look at the graph of their results, you see here a curious thing, that is, this goes from 0 to 40,000 pounds. These are kips. Kips is 1,000 pounds. That's structural engineering talk. And so at 0 degrees, you got no deflection. As you run the temperature up this way to 800 degrees centigrade, this is what happens to the forces that are applied to the structure. And it shows that at this point here, you've got 80,000 pounds pushing outward on the building. And then all of a sudden, at this point here, a little under 600 degrees centigrade, the thing collapses and it goes into tension, and then it runs up to about 20,000 pounds in tension, and then the thing fails. So that's their analysis of what happened, based upon their testing of a half-size structure. This is their finite element analysis. This is a computer model. This shows the perimeter columns. These are the floor trusses. They're 80 inches apart. These are the interior columns, and you see that the floor trusses run between the interior columns and the beams that connect them out to the perimeter columns. So their global model could not produce an inward force from sagging floor trusses which could pull the columns inward. In other words, no matter how they played with it, they couldn't get enough force on the by the floor trusses to pull these columns in. So they got creative. In their model, they applied a 5,000 pound force to each connection to the floor truss at the perimeter columns, because they had to get the perimeter columns to bend inward. We'll see in the videos that that's what happened when the tower started to come down. We'll show that in a minute. But they couldn't get it to happen in their model, so they applied a 5,000 pound force to each one of those connections in the impact zone. Now that's not kosher. I mean, you have to have some reason. Where is its 5,000 pounds supposed to have come from at each connection? What that means is that they took all these floors, the 99th through the 95th, they applied 5,000 pounds at each joint. That's a total of about 750,000 pounds that they applied to the face of that building with their computer model that wasn't there in reality. But they had to do it to make their model look like the reality. So this is a serious problem. I mean, I don't know how they justify this or how they can explain it, and we'll see later that they don't. So they had to do that because photographs of the wall showed that it bent inward before it collapsed. So that's why they needed to put in that 5,000 pounds on each connection. This is a photograph that shows the inward bending. It's not very clear, unfortunately, but they put a grid on this thing with a computer, and they can measure the distance from the grid into the face, and they had a maximum bowing in of like 55 inches. So they had to replicate that with their model. So here's their explanation, and just bear with me for a minute. This is their explanation for how the buildings came down. They said, first of all, you had bowing of the columns. As more columns buckled, the entire width of the south wall buckled. Instability started at the center of the south wall and rapidly progressed horizontally toward the sides. Remember, the plane hit on the north side for the north tower. So it's not very believable that the collapse would be initiated on the opposite side, on the other side of the core columns. But this is their explanation. As a result of the buckling of the south wall significantly unloaded, redistributed its load to the softened core through the hat truss. We'll talk about the hat truss in a minute. And to the east and west walls through the spandrels. The spandrels are the plates that are welded to the perimeter columns to hold them together. 2 minutes before the collapse, the north, east, and west walls at the 98th floor carried about 7%, 35%, and 30% more gravity loads than they did right after impact, and the south wall carried about 7%, and the core 20% less loads. So remember, the perimeter walls can carry 500%. Okay? This says that they're only carrying like 7%, 35%, 30%. Well, that's nothing. That's nothing on those columns. They can withstand 500% of the load. So this is not an explanation for why those columns would fail. And it says the section above the impact zone tilted to the south as the column instability progressed rapidly from the south wall to the east and west walls, resulting in increased gravity load on the core columns, the release of potential energy due to the downward movement of the building mass above the buccal columns exceeded the strain energy that could be absorbed by the structure. Global collapse ensued. Now, those three words right there are their total explanation for why the lower part of the building failed. They never produce any analysis that shows why the lower part of the building below the impact would give up. So you can see why we're having some problems with this report. If this was a college course and the structural engineers gave you an analysis that looked like this, if that's what the students turned in, it would be an F. It doesn't explain it at all. In fact, it only raises further questions. So these are the problems. There's no evidence or basis for the claim that sagging trusses could pull in the south wall of the north tower. The NIST model did not generate the loads on the south wall needed to pull them inward. They applied artificial loads, that's the 5,000 pounds to each connection, but with a factor of safety of 5, the load increase to the east and west walls of 35% and 30% would only increase the demand on those columns to about 27% of their capacity. So there's no reason to expect them to fail. This simply assumes a horizontal propagation across the building. No proof for it. NIST simply assumes global vertical collapse would ensue and then relies on a paper by Northwestern University professor Zdeněk Bezant for an explanation of the vertical collapse propagation. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. The video evidence shows that the core columns are what actually collapse first. So contrary to what NIST says, it wasn't the perimeter columns that failed first, it was the core columns that failed first. Now the reason why they didn't want to say that was because they knew that there was hardly any damage to the core columns. Why would the core columns fail first when there was hardly any damage to them? They had to have an explanation that said the perimeter columns failed first. They were stuck with that because the evidence shows that that's what happened. And here's that evidence. This is the North Tower. And again, this is why we're focused on the North Tower, because we can see in this video, you're going to see Gene Corley, who was the lead engineer he was the primary investigator for the investigation that NIST conducted. And he's going to explain why the core columns failed first. And he's going to show it.
When the collapse finally starts, the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started. And that tells us that the core columns let go first.
There you have it. He was working with FEMA, the original report, the initial damage report, and he said, looking at the video, you can see that the core columns fail first because the antenna starts to go down before the perimeter does. So that means that the core columns fail first because the core columns supported the antenna. You can see it here in these still frames. Here's the antenna. Here's the top of the building. And you can see as the time frames progress that the antenna is dropping and the top of the building is not moving yet.
Where's the 98th floor, please?
98th floor, this is 110 floors here. So you're down, it's out of the picture. It's below this. You're only down here about probably 10 floors. So the FEMA report said that the core columns fail first. Remember, the FEMA report was the first report that was done. FEMA came in to examine the evidence and issued a report in 2002 in April, and they said, well, this is what we saw, and it needs further investigation. So they said, well, the core columns fail first because the videos show that the antenna dropped first. The transmission tower on top of the structure began to move downward and laterally slightly before movement was evidenced at the exterior wall. This is a direct quote from their report. This suggests that the collapse began with one or more failures in the central core area of the building. That's directly quoted from their report issued 7 months after the event. This is a look at the hat truss. A hat truss is a steel structure at the top of the building that was designed to transfer the vertical and lateral loads between the perimeter columns and the core columns. So here we see the core columns. The truss out here, they don't show the perimeter columns, but the truss rests between the perimeter columns out here and the interior columns, the core columns here, and the antenna sat on top of that. So when the core columns started to fail, the antenna started to drop, and only after that did the perimeter columns begin to fail. So that's an important point. How did the thing start? Where did it start? And NIST says it started with the perimeter columns, and there's no evidence to support that. And in fact, the FEMA report directly contradicts that. Here's a schematic of it. You can see the perimeter columns out here, the core columns in the middle, and what the video evidence and the FEMA analysis say is that first the core columns fail, then the hat truss and the antenna descend before the perimeter columns, then the core columns pull on the floor trusses, and finally the floor trusses pull in the perimeter columns, and that's what begins the collapse. Instead of fires buckling the floor trusses, it's the core of the building failing first and pulling the perimeter columns in with the floor trusses. It would look something like this. Oh, well, here's a picture. This video is going to show you the perimeter columns being pulled in right before the building comes down. This is the south tower. You can see it right here. So because this is the visual evidence, NIST had to have an explanation for why that happened. That's what's going on. So what we are saying, and what the FEMA report says, is that the core columns pulled on the floor trusses and the floor trusses pulled in the perimeter columns. That's what started the building to fail. And it looks like this. The core columns are failing. The floor trusses are tied to both the perimeter and the core. And when the core columns fail and move downward, they pull in on the perimeter columns, and that's why you see the perimeter columns being pulled in. It's a completely different analysis. And then the question is, well, what was the damage to the core column that failed the core columns and caused them to collapse first when there was very little damage to the core columns? The aircraft hardly reached the core columns. And this must have occurred somewhere down below because the core columns are moving downward into the area of the building that was not damaged by the aircraft. There was no damage down there. There was no fire. There was no impact. Why was this happening? So there was a professor at Northwest University by the name of Zdeněk Bazant. And 2 days after the event, on September the 13th, 2001, he submitted a paper to a Journal of Engineering Mechanics, which is an ASCE publication, and he had an explanation for why the towers came down. Now, this is a pretty remarkable feat. 2 days afterwards, he's got an analysis that shows how the buildings collapsed. Pretty remarkable. He didn't have the structural drawings. He didn't know anything about the temperatures. He knew nothing about the damage to the columns, but he had an analysis that showed exactly why the buildings came down. So he's a pretty interesting guy, by the way. He's not a structural engineer. His specialty is fracture analysis in ceramics. And he's a brilliant guy. He used to be the editor of the journal that he submitted the paper to. And he was the editor there for 8 years. He's been a professor at Northwestern University since the late 60s. He's 93 years old. He's still teaching and still working. And he's a brilliant guy. There's no question about it. He can write papers that will make your head swim. He came from the old Czechoslovakian country. His father was a famous engineer in Czechoslovakia, and he was in the United States, as it so happened, in 1967 when the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia, and he was given asylum in the United States to stay in this country. So that's his background. Why he decided to weigh in on this is somewhat of a mystery. It's not his field, and yet he has stood by this report, and the editors have stood by it since then, which is going on 22 years now. So that's a little bit about the theory of why that justifies the NIST analysis. So they published this theory called Why Did the World Trade Center Collapse? A Simple Analysis by Besant and one of his graduate students in the Journal of Engineering Mechanics in January of 2002, a few months after the event. He said that a large dynamic load would have occurred caused by what he termed a powerful jolt, and that would overcome the reserve strength of the columns below. So that's his theory, right? The impact zone was weakened. The top of the building fell on the lower part of the building as a result of the weakening. It was so great of an impact that it caused the bottom of the building to collapse. And then when the top part of the building hit the ground, it also collapsed. So he called it a crush down, crush up theory. So people raised some various questions about this. So he defended it, and he said what did and did not cause the collapse of the World Trade Center, and that came out in October of 2008. So for several years, there was a lot of controversy about this theory of his. And he finally had to respond to it, and so he published a second paper in the same journal 7 years later. So this is a brief description, and I'll try to not bore you with this, but he used an energy analysis to construct his progressive collapse theory. So he said that the kinetic energy of the upper part of the building, that is the weight of the upper part of the building, was bigger than the resistance of the buckling in the collapse initiation zone, the inertial resistance of the structure in the building below the initiation zone, and the structural resistance of the columns in the building below the initiation zone. So in other words, the top of the building had enough power when it hit the lower part of the building to overcome the resistance and cause it to collapse. That was his theory. Okay, well, maybe that's true. In math, it looks like this. E1, the kinetic energy of the upper part, was greater than the other three energies of the lower part of the building. Pretty simple. We know that Newton's third law of motion says that for every motion, there's an equal and opposite. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Fundamental physics. However, there was a professor, a high school teacher actually, David Chandler, and he took the video of the building collapsing, and he showed that the building, this is the velocity of the top of the roof versus the time. So this is the acceleration going down. It's about 2/3 of the rate of free fall. And he's saying, wait a minute, there's no jolt here. Remember, if you play pool, right, you hit the cue ball hits the object ball, and the cue ball stops and transfers its momentum to the other ball. There has to be a transfer of power there, right? It's got to happen. If the top of the building fell down and crushed the lower part of the building, there had to be a jolt. Besant himself said that. But when you analyze the video, there's no jolt. There's no pause. There's no change in this. So that became the next point of contention. There's no deceleration, and that's needed to apply the load to the bottom part of the building. So a couple of guys, Tony Zambodi is a mechanical engineer in New Jersey, and he's kind of a tough old New Jersey type of guy. And he said, you know, this is not working. And so he published this paper with his co-author, Graham McQueen, and it's called The Missing Jolt, a simple refutation of the NIST-Besant collapse hypothesis. And they wouldn't publish it, so he put it on this Journal of 9/11 Studies, which is an online blog. So then David Chandler, he came out with his analysis and said there's no jolt. When you look at the videos, it doesn't ever pause. And so Besant had to come back again and defend his theory again. And so in January of 2011, he published another paper, Why the Observed Motion History of the World Trade Center is smooth. In other words, why is there no jolt? I said there was a jolt, but it doesn't seem to look like there is, but now I'm going to explain that. So then Zambodi and Zambodi again with another author, submitted another discussion paper that replied to that and said, why the observed motion history of the World Trade Centers is smooth. He says, we're going to explain that. Well, this went on. A year later, they were notified by the editors that they were not going to publish their paper. This is not kosher in the world of engineering or science. If you publish a paper and somebody comes along and challenges the paper, then you are obliged to publish that paper, and if you're going to deny it or move against it, you have to say so. You got to give your reasons. They've come along, they've criticized your paper, they're saying there's something wrong with it. You've got to respond to that. But the editors were old buddies of Besant's from his days when he was the editor, and they said, no, we're not gonna. They gave it to a reviewer, and the reviewer came back and gave them some answers, and they said, Zambodi and Johns responded to that rebuttal, and they said, no, there's errors in that. And so then another year went by, and so they sent a letter to the editors, and they said, hey, what's up? 3 months later, the editors, these two guys, Caspar Willem and Roberto Ballerini, responded that the discussion paper was out of scope and would not be published. Well, how can a paper that is in response to something that you've already published be out of scope? That's not kosher either. So they're looking for reasons not to publish this paper. And the reason they don't want to publish this paper is because if the paper was correct and it couldn't be refuted, then that meant that the whole theory of how these towers came down, that the NIST report has been depending upon all these years, would all fail. Okay? So they have not published that paper to this day. It is still, Zambodi and Johns have filed a grievance with the JAM, and they have been messing around with that grievance since 2012. They still have not resolved it. There's a whole process that they can go through. If you object to what they've done with your paper, you can go all the way to the board of the ASCE and force them to confront this issue. They have refused to do that up until this point. Hasn't happened yet. We're still after them. Zambodi and Johns are still trying to get this paper published. That's all they're asking for. Just publish the paper. And then see what the response is. Can anybody refute it? No. Nobody. They don't want to have that discussion. So this is an indication really, this is the bottom line. Something is really wrong because they have destroyed this whole process that has been built up over centuries for how we resolve these issues when there's a difference of opinion. So here's the problems. We've gone through this. Here's what Besant did. He used the maximum design load for the mass of the upper part of the building. Well, the upper part of the building, the maximum design load is not what happened that day. Okay? It's what you had, the working load, which was not anything like the maximum load. So that was that's a trick on his part. He said that the fall through the initiation zone, in other words, where the impact was, he said that was absolutely at free fall. Well, that wasn't true because there were still columns there that were buckling and holding some resistance, if that buckling, in fact, was occurring that way. So that was something that was not kosher. And then he said that the conservation of momentum used the wrong mass for the stories in the upper part of the building. So that was too low. The conservation of momentum calculation used only 627,000 mass for the story below, which is about 14% of the 3.87 million kilograms mass he used for the stories in his 14-story upper section. So the E3, for the conservation of momentum in the lower part of the building, was too low by a factor of 7. Then the last thing he did was he estimated the resistance of the columns. It was only about 31% of what can actually be shown to be, so that was too low by a factor of 3. So he underestimated the resistance at the bottom, and he overestimated the force at the top. By playing with those numbers, he could make it seem as if his equation worked. But in fact, when you put in the right numbers, this is what his equation looks like. E1 is less than E2 plus E3 plus E4, and the building won't collapse. So, you can make your model work whatever way you want, depending upon what input values you put. They have to be realistic, though. And he was cherry-picking numbers and falsifying their magnitude to make it look as if his equation would work. And that's what the Zambodi paper is pointing out, and that's why they won't publish his paper. Here's a measurement of what the high school teacher showed in terms of deceleration. This is what Besant claimed with his theory. See, he shows a little bitty bump right here. And this is what it would look like if you use the correct values, which shows that after about 2 seconds, the velocity of the upper part of the building would stop, and it would be 0. So in other words, no collapse mechanism. Here's a picture taken from the helicopter. One of the helicopters that day shows the North Tower coming down. Where's the top of the building? It isn't there. He says that the top part of the building is what's driving this collapse. Yet this photo shows that it's already dissolved. How was it that this gravity-driven collapse could throw parts of the building and huge sections of the structure up to 600 feet all around the perimeter of the building? And here's a video that shows the North Tower coming down. Here's the antenna. Watch what's happening to the upper part of the building and watch the lower part of the building, and you'll see that the upper part of the building is collapsing on itself before it even hits the lower part of the building. See? This hasn't moved yet. The upper part of the building is being blown up. It's not going to impact the lower part of the building and drive it to the ground because it's already been blown apart.
You mean explosives?
Yeah. Right. So here's a picture of the North Tower as the collapse begins, and what we want to point out here is that oops, wait, sorry. The uniformly symmetrical squibs that come out all around the building as it's, oh wait, that's the south tower. Let me back up again. The north tower. Note the smoke coming out evenly all around the building as it starts to collapse. Well, if you've got an asymmetric damage because of the airplane, why would you have symmetrical signs of failure? Same thing on the south tower. Symmetrical signs of failure all around the building. Plane hit it at an angle on one side. This is just saying the same thing, really. The collapse is advancing evenly and progressing in a straight line around the building. How could symmetrical progression occur due to asymmetrical damage? The next point is that there's never been a steel frame building that collapsed due to fires. So here's a building in LA, 1988, burned for 3.5 hours over 5 floors, didn't collapse. Philadelphia, 1991, 38-story building burned for 18 hours over 8 floors, didn't collapse. 2004, Caracas, 56-story building burned for 17 hours over 26 floors, never collapsed. Because fire doesn't affect steel in a way that's going to cause it to lose so much of its strength that the building is going to collapse. That's why we build buildings out of steel, high rises. That's the whole point. Fires were a problem in old wooden frame buildings. It caused great loss of life. Steel was seen as the structural material that was going to prevent that from happening. That's why it's never happened, but we're told that it happened 3 times in New York City on the same day. Never before, never since. So this is a guy that's the editor of the Fire Engineering magazine, and he's complaining about the destruction of the evidence. And he says, structural steel from the World Trade Center has been and continues to be cut up and sold for scrap. Such destruction of evidence shows the astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. How are you going to determine what happened to the steel if you hauled all the steel off under high security and shipped it to China for recycling? He's very kind. Astounding ignorance, he calls it. He's very kind. So here we're going to talk about the destruction of the evidence again. Here we have Gene Corley again, and he was testifying before Congress, and he was asked some questions, and here's his response.
When did you become aware that the steel from the World Trade Center was being sold off?
I think it was on the order of a week or so before we arrived on site on October the 5th, I believe it was.
So in other words, the city was selling or was disposing of material within 2 weeks of the actual event?
I believe I was the first one to find out that the steel is being recycled. New York Times reporter Jim Glantz told me 2 weeks after the collapse, and I tried to contact city, and also New York Times reporters tried to make sure we can have access to steel to do the research. It was not happening.
I just think there's so much that has been lost in these last 6 months that we can never go back and retrieve. And it's not only unfortunate, it's borderline criminal.
400 truckloads per day of material were taken away from the World Trade Center site and sent to China for recycling.
There were laws violated in the destruction of that evidence. And for the American Society of Civil Engineers to ignore those events is extremely disturbing and is a violation, in my opinion, of their professional code of ethics.
It was contrary to the way all investigations are done. If an airplane crashes, they seal off the entire area, nobody touches anything, they move it to a secure location, and they reconstruct an aircraft.
Normally, when you have a structural failure, You carefully go through the debris field, looking at each item, photographing every beam as it collapsed and every column where it is in the ground, and you pick them up very carefully and you look at each element. We were unable to do that in the case of Tower 7.
You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned, this is not science. It's trying to prove preconceived ideas.
So they refer to Building 7 there, but the same thing is true for the towers. Towers, they hauled off Building 7 immediately because there was no casualties in that building. They had evacuated the building. There was some search and rescue that was required for the towers because they were hoping they would find somebody alive, and they did find some people alive. But as soon as that period of time had passed, approximately 10 days or 2 weeks later, they started with the same process and hauling off the steel. They saved, I think, 236 pieces of steel from the entire 2 towers. And they tested those for what kind of heat they had been subjected to. They could only find 6 pieces of steel that had been subjected to temperatures above 250 degrees centigrade. And steel doesn't lose any strength at 250 degrees centigrade. It has to be well above 300 degrees before you start to lose strength. So then they said, well, we didn't have enough of a sample. But they had taken their sample from the area where the planes had hit and where the fires were. And then they said they didn't have enough of a sample. But they were the ones that selected the sample, and they were the ones that, shipped it all off. So in terms of the destruction of the evidence, this guy here, John Gross, he was one of the lead investigators for NIST. And he was in the salvage yard deciding what material to save for further analysis. And here you see him with a piece of steel that has been eroded all the way through and has been turned into a piece of Swiss cheese-like. There's no office fire or diesel fuel fire that could cause that kind of damage to steel. And yet they claimed that there was no evidence of explosives, no evidence of incendiaries. They never checked for any incendiaries or explosives, and they said that there was no reason to because they didn't believe that anybody had heard explosions or anything that would indicate that there had been an attack on the building using explosives or incendiaries. So that is their excuse. Then there's the issue of the temperatures that were found in the basement of all 3 buildings. Here's Building 1, Building 2, Building 7. This is a USGS survey, aerial photograph 5 days later, indicates temperatures as high as 1,377 degrees Fahrenheit based on the infrared analysis. And there were also quantities of molten metal found in the debris for months afterwards, and that was never explained. There was no way you could explain that with office fires and diesel fuel. They just ignored it. So anyway, we go through these are all the problems that we've just got through enumerating. I'm not going to drive you crazy going through them again, but we've got a list here of 5, 6, 7 things that were wrong with their theory. And we've just gone through them one by one. So I don't want to put you to sleep with going through them again. If we put them into categories, we find 7 different categories. This is both the towers and Building 7. The 3rd, 4th, and 6th only apply to Building 7. But as far as the towers go, they have a defective collapse initiation theory. They make unjustified assumption and errors in their reports. They have errors in the calculations of the ASCE theories, and they have refusal to respond to peer criticism. We've asked them to respond. They say, if we tell you what we did, it's going to jeopardize public safety. So we end this by asking, you know, what would you like to do? What could you do if you're an architect or an engineer? We have a petition on our website. You can sign it. Calls for a new investigation. You can disseminate this information to engineering colleagues. This is what we're doing. We're going around to the grassroots organizations and talking to the engineers in person, saying, this is what we found. What do you think? Do you support the idea that we need a new investigation? Because if we could get a new investigation, and if it came out with a reality picture of what happened, then NIST would be forced to re-examine and issue a new report. Because right now they say, well, the report is fine because the Engineering Association leadership supports us, and they agree with us. In fact, I've got a letter, an anonymous letter, that they send out to their chapters. When they find out that we're going around and talking to their chapters, this is an anonymous letter that they send to the leaders of those chapters. I'll just read it to you. In the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the Structural Engineering Institute of the American Society of Civil Engineers formed expert teams comprised of more than 30 leading civil, structural, fire protection, and forensic engineers to conduct studies of the structural performance of the buildings at the World Trade Center and Pentagon. In addition, the National Institute of Standards and Technology conducted an extensive analysis which cost in excess of $16 million to determine the probable cause of the building collapses. Both the ASCE and NIST studies included analysis of potential collapse mechanisms and sequences. ASCE and other professional and technical organizations provide a variety of forums for research to be presented, reviewed, discussed, and debated in a continual effort to advance the practice of civil engineering. And these forums have been used extensively to explore the civil engineering issues associated with September 11. ASCE has publicly shared our reports, and we stand by the conclusions of the reports, which are supported by the facts and sound engineering analysis. So they basically say, it's all good, no need to look at this anymore. We've already had experts perform the studies. We spent $16 million, couldn't possibly be wrong. We know that we're good, okay? So they're just, at this point, you know, it's beyond farce. It's a crime. It's accessory after a felony. It is a criminal act that our professional leaderships are involved in. Now, we're not saying that they planned the event, but they were sucked into the cover-up. They were used as a cover to explain to the public what happened. And that explanation does not hold water. They are violating their ethical and professional principles by so doing. And that is what we're trying to point out. And we're trying to educate the public so that you understand that this battle is going on behind the scenes. I'm sure you probably haven't heard of this in the papers. There's nobody telling you that this struggle is going on in the engineering profession. It's all being kept under the rug. And we're carrying out this struggle, you know, just because we know that they're wrong, and we know that this has damaged our profession. It has damaged our professional reputation, and it has resulted in training engineers in this false story. How would you like an engineer that believed these stories to be designing the structures that you're going to be using? I don't think so. Do you really want that kind of error and that kind of malfeasance and that kind of incompetence to be brought into the structures that you're going to be depending upon in the future? I don't. So that's why we're doing what we're doing. And we are a small, tiny little organization, tiny little nonprofit. Everybody that works for us pretty much volunteers their time. I get no salary. None of the people on the board get a salary. None of the people that have contributed to these reports got any money for them. We pay some staff to run our website. We pay an office manager. We pay people to do some of the traveling that they have to travel back and forth. Fortunately, I came up from Pocatello. Doug was kind enough to pay for the hotel room. I mean, really, this is unprecedented. And I can't tell you, this is a great venue, great interest in the community here, and I really appreciate the fact that you've all come out and you're paying attention to what's going on and being hidden from you by our mainstream media, which is not doing its job, and by our professional organizations, which have sold out our ethical premises and preventing us from getting to the bottom of this. And we do have a sign-up sheet in the back on the table. If you would like more information, if you'd like to stay in touch, please give us your information. We will contact you. Last week, there was a gentleman that came here. I don't see him tonight, Mark Bishop. He has actually written a book about 9/11, and he sent me the transcript. It's a 220-page book, and it's great. He's got all kinds of great stuff in there, and he never got it published. And I think that that's a shame, and we're going to try to help him get it published. And we can present a lot. He has a chapter in there on the cover-up, but we have a lot of information here that he doesn't have. We can put it in there and hopefully make his book a little bit more informed on that particular subject. So remember, the crime had 3 phases: the planning, the execution, and the cover-up. And we're still living in the cover-up period. And that cover-up has to be ongoing, because as new things come to light, they have to find ways to cover it up and suppress it. So I'm through for tonight. If you've got some questions or comments, I'd be glad to entertain them. Yeah.
Could you
Sure. Yeah, I know for other structural failures and things like this, sometimes in order to determine the causes or test or confirm a cause, they'll try to do a model of something. Has anybody ever done a smaller scale model and tried to model it to see what really happened?
For the towers?
Yes.
Well, here's the problem. We cannot get our hands on the drawings. The drawings have been sequestered. Okay? So we can't get the basic information to begin to do that. We have been trying for a long time. We've got some of the drawings. We've got partial drawings. But we need the whole thing before we can begin to put a model together.
So you could do it.
You could do it. You would need a very powerful system, because obviously this is a big structure. It's got a lot of connection and so on and so forth. But in many ways, it's very simple, because it's 2 cores, one core inside the other core. Once you laid it out, the complication would be in the different strengths of steel that they used and so on and so forth. So it could get pretty complicated. But a strong program could do it. They claim that they did it, but they won't release it. And as we see, they don't have any explanation for why the lower part of the building was crushed. None. And they won't release their data. Yes, sir.
Regarding the flame discussion, the burning of the fuel, we don't see any, I don't think you showed any of the actual live footage of the airplane impacts, but as I recall seeing them that day and seeing the replays of them, flame did carry through what appeared to be the path of the wreckage of the plane penetrating the building, and I think on the second building, the south tower got hit second. I believe it was much more significant, I think, because of the glancing angle. So while I don't find fault, I'm not qualified to find fault with your discussion of the structural defects and what is possible and what is not possible. Recognizing that jet fuel is a mixture of gasoline and kerosene, the kerosene would have more staying power in the fire. The kerosene portion of it, of course, the gasoline burning it would excite it greater and cause it to burn faster off. But all that being said, it doesn't call into question, to me, any of your discussion about the structural collapse. I just wanted to note that about the fire itself, though.
Yeah, well, I'm just, I'm taking from the NIST report. I mean, their conclusion was, we're trying to replicate what they said in their conditions. So we essentially used their fire analysis and didn't question it, although we don't think it's right. We're saying this is what they used, this is the load that they applied through the thermal effects to the structure. We'll take that load and we'll see what we can come up with. And so not trying to verify their conclusions, but just trying to follow their path and see if we could replicate it.
So the molten steel at the bottom and the infrared photographs, isn't that the smoking gun? Isn't that the reason that we can't believe these guys? Because how would that happen? That molten steel does not just happen. Unless some guy down there with an arc welder or something, right?
Well, their answer to that, and unfortunately I don't have, John Gross, who we saw a picture of there, he was confronted with that evidence when they released the report back in 2005. And somebody said, well, what about the molten steel? And he says, unfortunately I don't have it on this video, but he says, we don't have any evidence that there was any molten steel. There was no evidence of that. So they just simply, anything that they can't deal with, they simply deny its existence. And yet we have all kinds of video of the firemen saying, you know, and the first responders say, man, when we got down there, there was molten steel running down the, you know, the channels and so on. And so apparently he's saying all those people were delusional. Right. Yeah.
I think the most strikingly interesting thing about the way the buildings fell is they're reminiscent. If you've ever watched either video or in person seen a building demolition, it's beyond science, it's art to make a building completely liquefy onto its footprint. And that's what we saw. And to me, that's the most suspect thing about that. I mean, airplanes hitting the top floors and the entire building liquefying. The way they do it is through timed explosions. And that's exactly what we see.
Right. There was some difference between Building 7. In Building 7, the only way you can make it behave the way it did was to take out 8 floors simultaneously, low down in the building, and get it to drop, you know, 110 feet. Now, right. That was part of the cover story, and I would suggest that it's entirely plausible that they had they knew that there would be questions, so they had people lined up to call in and do the investigation that they knew that they could influence politically in some way or another, and they knew that they could get them to make decisions in the process of the investigation that would lead it off in this other direction, and refuse to even consider that it might be controlled demolition. So they knew that. They planned that ahead of time. And I would, well, I mean, who are they? I don't know, right? Yeah, the New World Order, you know, the shadow government, the deep state, you know, the Illuminati. I don't know. We're engineers. We're not that smart. We're just.
Let's take,
right.
John, let's spread it out, okay?
Okay.
So, Mike, I guess it's more of a comment. I've been on the World Trade Center museum tour. They have certain sections of the tour where you can't take pictures, you do video, right? But I physically attest, you know, I'll attest, I've seen the molten steel. It is a thing. It exists. It's in the tour if you ever get a chance to go. So, you know, for them to dispute that just seems kind of off that they could come up with that kind of a description that it didn't exist.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a lot of things in that museum that don't match up to the story that they were being told. Yes, sir.
So my question is how important was the exactness of where the plane hit in order to stage this to make it look the way it did in order to, I mean, to where they could, yeah, to make it possible? And I've been in military, your incendiary grenades and whatnot, they run about 4,000 degrees, 4,000 to 5,000 degrees. I mean, basically you're looking at realms of temp in that area. And I mean, the things that have to play in order to stage all this, how important is the exactness to make that happen?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't really know the answer to it, but I figure that whoever pulled this off, in the first place, they were very expert, and they had access to materials, nanothermite, which was clearly used because the nanothermite residue was found in the dust. So they had access to a material that was not commercially available. So I'm sure that a lot of this was, I mean, this was a first and one-time only deal for them, right? I mean, really, nothing like this had ever been done on this scale with this material. And the people that did it had a good idea of what they were doing. I think there were some mistakes made, but they basically had a pretty good day there. And they had how important, I figure, just from my perspective, I would think that they had various levels that they could have set the thing off at, depending upon where the plane hit. And you have a timed sequence, right? And you just want to decide where you take the sequence from. If it had hit at the 80th floor instead of the 95th floor, they would have started the sequence there and gone up and down from there. I think that was their plan. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to comment also that the graphic that you had of the antenna mast on top of Tower 1, I think it was, and the illustration of the trusses that were in place underneath that, and then the discussion of how that antenna mast fell in ahead of the rest, the outer shell of the building, that speaks a lot to me right there, that it's so incredibly interconnected there. Really, it's for the amount of mass in the antenna mast, which was not much, and for it to fall in, suggests a very compelling destruction of the supporting structures underneath. It really defies any rational explanation from the official story.
Yeah, and that's why they had to insist upon the perimeter columns going first, because there was no way that people were going to believe that the interior columns failed first, because they suffered relatively little damage. Yes, ma'am.
There's a possibility. Some people have been talking, I guess there's even film alleging that it was a CGI plane. That there were people on the ground who heard the explosion, saw the plane, or not the plane, but saw the explosion from the building, and they had been shut up. And then on the news, even the newscasters had been briefed on what was going to happen, and saw the video of the plane was spliced in. It wasn't actual plane that hit the building.
Yeah, I've heard that story. I mean, there's other explanations. Some people say it was a directed energy weapon. Judy Wood says that. There are people that say it was a nuclear device in the bottom of the building and blah, blah, blah. Listen, until we get a real investigation, none of those things are going to be answered properly. And what we're saying is, to the people that are promoting those theories and believe them, join us in calling for a new investigation. Instead, Judy Wood brought a QTAM lawsuit against the government in which she would have collected tens of millions of dollars. So she's looking out after her own interest instead of saying there really needs to be a new investigation, even if it was a directed energy weapon, or if it was nuclear, or if it was CGI planes, or whatever it was. All these people should be saying we need a new investigation, but they don't. Instead, they go out and they promote themselves, and they promote their websites, and they're interested in making money for themselves and, somehow becoming famous in the 9/11 truth movement. Listen, we need a new investigation. You're not going to get any settlement of this, and it's really a political question. And what I really liked about the book that Mark gave to me was he said, in essence, it is a political problem. It's a political problem, and you're not going to get an answer. We've been going to Congress for years. We've drafted an act called the Bobby McIlvaine Act, which is named after a young man that was killed in the North Tower, and his father, Bob McIlvaine, has been part of the 9/11 truth movement all this time. He's trying to get a new investigation, and this act would enable Congress, if they passed it, to call for a new investigation. We haven't found a single politician on either side of the aisle that will raise this issue in Congress. So what Mark's book suggested was maybe we need a new political party. He points out that the Whig Party before the Civil War was a single issue party. The issue was slavery. They elected 3 presidents on one issue. Okay? Maybe it's time for a 9/11 party to form. And, my experience is that people on both sides of the political spectrum agree with our analysis. Maybe it is the issue that could unite both sides and if, you know, you could be a 9/11 Democrat or you could be a 9/11 Republican, which would tell people that, hey, if I get elected, I'm going to push for this issue to be resolved. And I'm seriously going to do that. And that way, we'd create some kind of unity that would be helpful to the country and get to the bottom of this issue, which really set the tone for the whole 21st century, which I think we can all agree hasn't been good for us. Yes, sir.
You know, it seems to me, listening through all this, that you just have a lot of substantial facts that would be, let's say, good material for a vigorous public debate with the other side. I think I know what you're going to tell me, but have you ever reached out to them and said, hey, you guys bring your facts, we'll bring ours, and we'll have this public debate? And that wouldn't even be opening the investigation again. That would just be, you know, we disagree with you, you disagree with us, let's debate it out and let people decide for themselves.
Well, I wholeheartely agree with you that that's something that we should push for harder. We've made it clear to NIST that we disagree with their conclusions. We've submitted a legal document, request for correction, which we're entitled to do under the American Procedures Act, and they have simply, they just characterize us as conspiracy theorists, and you know, and lay personnel. They call us lay people. They say we have no expertise, we don't know what we're talking about, and you know, I mean, I agree with you. An open debate would be the best thing. Would be the best thing. We'd be glad to do that, and we will push for it. That's one of the tracks that we're on. But if you don't get any news coverage, nobody knows that you're challenging them, and you know, and the thing goes unremarked. They simply drop the drawbridge and hide behind the walls and hope that you'll die and go away. I mean, that's what they're doing now. Yes, sir.
So in terms of that debate, that letter that they send out from the ASCE everywhere you guys go is basically your answer to that. They're not willing to debate. They're saying we have the authority and this is what we say, and don't come and listen to these clowns, right? That's what they're saying. They're basically saying these are not the droids you're looking for, right?
Right.
That's what they're saying. And I'll say that this is the same government that said the USS Maddox was attacked unprovoked in the Gulf of Tonkin. They're the same ones that say there's no biolabs. You know, they, for the last 3 years, they cancel you if you said, hey, there might have been a leak at this lab. And now they're saying, oh, yeah, there was a leak at this lab, right? And they're doing that for a reason. But it's the same ones that undermine your faith in the medical establishment at this point. All these professional institutions are being undermined by nut jobs that's running our country. So I guess I had that was more of a statement than anything else. But the idea is that we are the authorities and you have no right to question the authorities. And we're seeing that in just about every facet of life at this point. So.
I actually have a question. The report that can't get published, you know, that's out of scope, is it written?
Yes.
Why do they have to publish it? Why can't they publish it, just send it out and publish it? I'll publish it. Why, you know, why can't we, what's the problem of them self-publishing, putting it out there?
Well, here's the issue. As I said, NIST is depending upon our professional leadership to back them up. So we have to challenge them in their bailiwick. The report is available. It's on the internet. You can read it. You can read all of them. We've published them all. So it's out there, but the key, it's like a log jam. It's like the keystone holding up the arch. There's one particular place that you need to apply the pressure, and that's at the top of our profession. And that profession has betrayed us. And they are using their power and their authority to continue to roadblock this and to provide this cover-up. And that's why we're applying the pressure there. But I agree also with what Mr. Bishop says, that it is a political problem, and maybe we need to go through the political process as well. We've tried that. We can't get any takers, but maybe a separate political party or a 9/11 group within the party is the answer. I don't know. That's an intriguing question, I think.
Well, I've been accused of starting another political party, but I'm not going to do that necessarily. But the question, the comment I would make is that, so that report that seems to be a very damaging report, if you will, is out there and available. And so if we were able to get it and obtain it and actually start putting it in front of certain people, politicians, these type of people, say, here's this. Why is this being? Why isn't this being looked at? Why isn't this being followed? Why aren't we going through the normal protocols for science-based evidence that we do and all these things? Maybe we could do that. So I don't know. I'd ask you afterwards, point out that report to me and whatnot, and we'll see if we can just get it some air a little bit. So that would be good.
That'd be great.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh.
Yes, sir.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. You're behind me.
All right, well.
Just hit me next time. Go ahead.
Who was to gain by having the towers come down? I mean, was it an attack from Russia or was it an internal thing?
Well, you look at who benefited. I mean, that's the old question is, who benefited?
Your organization
Cui bono?
benefited.
No, I haven't benefited. I've been spending, all this time that I could have been doing something else and not getting any pay for it.
Yeah, but those at the top.
No, not the top of my organization. We don't get paid. We're not getting paid.
No. Who put this report out?
Oh, you mean NIST?
This.
Well,
Yes.
NIST got paid to do it, but taxpayers' dollars, our dollars, paid them. Yeah, they benefited. But I actually think that they were probably were very reluctant to get involved here because they knew that it was wrong. They knew that they were being used as a cover-up. They must have been threatened or somehow coerced. They were scared. I'm sure fear was used. And I'm sure, listen, I have sympathy for them in one regard. I mean, they found themselves at the top of an organization. One day somebody came to them and said, you're going to print this report and it's going to be full of lies and you're going to back it up. I don't think they were happy about that. So I think one of the avenues that we're approaching is we've made a list of as many of the people that were involved in these reports as we can find, and we're going to contact them and ask them, could you please tell us what went on behind the scenes during this investigation? Who was really calling the shots, and why was this decision arrived at, and who was the ones that were pushing for that? Because right now we've got a room full of about 500 suspects in the cover-up, and we would like to reduce that down to about 20 or 30, because I think that's what it really is. The rest of them were coerced or dragged into it in some way that they could not say no to. And those people are still alive, most of them, and we'll try to find out what they have to say. And that's one of the avenues that we're proceeding on. But as to who benefited, why they would do it, I think you need to look at the companies that made money off of it, the government that's involved in overreach and surveillance and all this other stuff that's going on now, which appears like there's people in control now that want to have total control of our life, want us to return to the slavery aspect of the way society used to be, only using technology to enforce it. They want to get rid of a lot of the people on the face of the earth. They think there's too many of us, etc. So, I think somewhere in there, those people that carried this out, carried it out. Yes, sir.
No, you got to talk into this. I have people watching online.
Did you watch the documentary Fahrenheit 9/11?
Uh-huh.
The video evidence directly supports the engineering calculations and your engineering analysis that you presented tonight.
Yep.
So if you want to see something, watch that.
What was it again?
Fahrenheit 9/11. And it shows the sequence of explosions below the 95th floor. when it begins. I mean, you saw it.
Yep.
And you don't have to be an engineer to understand that. I mean, Doug and I are used to this, but you don't have to be an engineer to see what happened. And they do it in time-lapse film, so it's unmistakable.
Yeah, it's out there. It's a great thing about this era that we're living in many ways. You know, after Pearl Harbor, there was 5 government investigations as to what had happened. And eventually they blamed the naval officer in charge and the Army officer in charge, and they were both punished. The naval officer wound up committing suicide. But that took years and years. See now, and the evidence was not clear. I think we've got clear evidence. We've got physics, you know, we've got engineering, we've got all the evidence that we need to prove. We'll stand up against anybody. Yeah, we'll challenge them and you know, come out and debate us and let people decide, you know, who's right and who's not right, or what are the mistakes anyway. We're perfectly willing to do that. And like I said, we've presented this to more than 1,000 engineers in the past 4 years. Nobody has said, hey, you know, you guys are nuts, you should give up. Not one engineer has said that. On the other hand, we have not ignited a movement from the grassroots up to knock out the leadership of our profession either, because there's reluctance to do that. So it's not an easy thing we're trying to do here.
All right, any other questions? Let's give Ed a big hand.
Thank you.